Okay, so today we are particularly excited to have Walt Cunningham, Brian Binney, Greg Olson, who's spoken here several times before, in fact, Katie Coleman, Bill Engels, Richard Gary, who is also a member of our board of directors, and of course Charlie Duke, who has been here several times before as well. I want to give particular thanks to the individuals, more specifically Jim and Stacy, who have put in a lot of work and effort in organizing this function. And I guess at this point, we're ready to go, Jim. Thanks.
Thank you, Will, and thank you guys for coming out so early. We have a big program today, and we're very honored to have with us, well, to start, and I think this is great chronologically, Apollo 7 astronaut Walt Cunningham. We'll get into this in questions, but Walt was on the pivotal Apollo 7 flight, which was really make or break for the Apollo flight program. They had sent some unmanned ones up, and of course they had the terrible fire on Apollo 1. These guys had to go up and make it happen, and they did. Anyway, thank you. We've had many legends on, but this is one of the greatest. Let's hear it for Walt Cunningham. Pretty good welcome. I keep fearing I'm going to call him Glenn Cunningham, the old quarterback from the, because I'm terrible with names. Anyway, we were talking beforehand. This is a great story, and I want you to explain it. Evidently, the number 13 and 14 had a lot to do with your career and your life. Talk about it.
Well, actually, like a lot of people, you learn things later that you didn't know when it was critical. But almost about 10 years ago, I get an email from a friend of mine, Paul Haney. Paul Haney was the head of public affairs when NASA selected me back in 1963. How many here were alive in 1963? Anyhow, after I got selected before I reported, I met Paul Haney. He was the only person I knew that was associated with NASA. And then after I left NASA, I wrote a book called The All-American Boys. That's a number of people here have that book. And Paul was a friend of mine, and I gave Paul a copy of that book. About 10 years ago, before Paul died, I get an email from Paul. He says, he just one sentence about something and said, "Oh, I've read the book, it's really good." And so I sent an email back. I said, "Paul," I says, I gave you that book, in 1977, you just read it. And he says, "Well, I went to the index and I checked what you said about me."
Very typical.
Yeah. And so then, he had one more sentence. He says, "You know you're number 14, don't you?"
And you were like, what does that mean?
That's right. Well, in our group, we were the third group of astronauts. They had 7 and they had 9, and they had 14. And I'm probably the only one of that group of 30 that has any idea where he stood on the selection process about it. Because nobody ever made it public or anything at all like that. I said, so I got on the phone, I called and asked him, here's the story he told me. He said, the day, we were, I think, October 14th in '63, they were announcing us, press conference, and a week before that, Deke Slayton, who was in charge of all the astronauts, he arranged a meeting with the head of Johnson Space Center and all the directors, the head of different people. So Paul Haney, as the head of public affairs, was going to be there. Well, Paul was on the phone when he started this meeting, and so he didn't get there when they started it, and when he finally got off the call, this is the story he's telling me. And he went down there and he went in, and Deke had just finished naming and giving a little brief background on all of the people that were selected. The head of engineering, I've got your name problem too, I can't remember his name right now, but anyhow, he was the guy that designed the spacecraft, and he was the best technical guy we had there. And as Paul walks in, he raises his hand and says, "Deke, you can't do that." Deke says, "Why?" He says, that's 13.
Meaning they chose 13 astronauts.
Yeah, and he says, you can't do that. And I couldn't believe that the technical guy was busy being superstitious about 13. And Deke says, well, and he says, whoever was number 13, he says, I really want this guy, so if I have to take another one, then he laid my brochure down there. I'm the only one to this day that knows when he was selected. I was number 14.
Yeah, and had that not happened, the 13, who knows, right?
Well, if that not happened, I wouldn't be here today.
Fate is the hunter.
True, good book.
Now, let's go back to something serious. Apollo 1, the fire. Your memories of that, where were you? And that must have been that's like this Challenger for us.
Yeah, Challenger probably is much more memorable for people to hear. Challenger and Columbia, both of them terrible disasters. But back in that time frame, and that was in 67 they had the fire. But in 66, at the beginning of 66, Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and I were assigned the crew of what would have been Apollo 2. Apollo 1 was Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And we were living with the contractors. I spent, 270 days out of the year. I was out at North American, Rockwell, that eventually became. And so we were living with the vehicles, bringing them out. There were so many things wrong that had to be fixed, so many engineering things, not to mention the operational challenges, trying to get changes in for operational uses that they didn't want to put in because of one thing. It wasn't the cost, it was the schedule. Kennedy had said, man on the moon this decade, and believe me, 10 years, you try to do something today in 10 years, but to get it there, they really wanted to keep moving along. So they stopped making all the improvements at one stage here, and they called it a Block 2 spacecraft. Well, when they made it Block 2 spacecraft, they canceled the second Block 1 spacecraft, and that was Wally, Don, and I. And since we were the only ones that had experience on the same one that Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee were, we became the backup crew. So we were the backup crew for about 3 months on Apollo 1. That number got changed.
More fate.
Yes, that's exactly right. So we were getting ready for liftoff. It was scheduled in February, I think, of 67, and we knew that there was a lot of things wrong with the spacecraft. We were living with it. In those days, I can just tell you that our guys, I guess you would call it an ego they had today, but we'd all been fighter pilots for at least a dozen years. Most of them were test pilots. We all had great confidence in ourselves, and we knew what was a lot of things that were wrong, but we'd find a way that we could handle that. And we knew that we had to work around on it. So we knew that the spacecraft was not great, but we were going to fly it anyway. And the afternoon of the Apollo 1 fire, we'd done that same test the night before, but it was what we called plugs in, so that the hatch was open, so we were using external power. And we waited all day. We were all going to fly back together, T-38s from the Cape back to Houston. Finally got late afternoon, like 5:30, and Wally, Don and I said, well, we're going to go home. And so we left them. They'd been in the spacecraft all day long. When we landed back at Ellington Air Force Base, the head of our flight ops walked out there to meet us. We knew something was wrong, and that's what happened. The fire had happened while we were in the air and coming back. So it was really a hell of a deal on it. Nothing they could do. The whole crew was dead in about 19 seconds. I worked on the fire investigation for a while. About 3 weeks later, Deke took us inside and said we were going to be on the first crew, but then they renumbered it. We ended up being Apollo 7. It was really the first manned flight.
You guys are steely, and you never have any emotion over it. Well,
Used to be.
Yeah. But emotionally, how did that hit you when you heard that? Did you kind of expect something crazy like that with the way you guys were running the program so quickly, or how did it hit you?
Well, we were shocked that it had happened. of course, because it was the first time that any astronaut had been killed in a spacecraft. You see, what people don't realize is what was going on back in those days. Our group of 14, in about 3 years, I think we lost 4 of them, airplane accidents, and then we lost Roger Chaffee, but 5 of that group ended up, dying one way or another. But so we kind of understood that, and I don't recall anybody ever really being terribly discouraged by the fire. We really wanted to get the first flight. I mean, we were very pleased. And Wally Schirra was already kind of looking forward to leaving NASA eventually, and so his attitude kind of changed on that. He started getting a lot more serious on the job. And I just felt very fortunate, and I don't remember us ever really being frightened about flying it. I mean, you fly airplanes and people get killed all the time, and rightly or wrongly, you usually find some reason to blame the pilot, and because then it wouldn't have happened to you.
Well, yeah, so talk about fear. How do you handle it, or do you have any?
I think I've got a little fear from time to time. In those days, I think I was just too stupid to be afraid. There's a attitudinal thing. I'm not a psychologist, but I read about a lot of that stuff. I think that there's a difference in mentality in how people feel about these things. Recognizing it, being aware of it, intellectually, is an important step. I think a lot of people are afraid of things because they don't have the faintest idea what's going to go on. It's an unknown, and so they're afraid of it. And then those that learn about things, they may be afraid of it because of what they know. And then there's some kind of a mental twerk that a lot of my friends and people out here today, they're aware of it. I mean, Brian, I know that he was aware of the things that could go wrong, and you have to have the kind of self-confidence that enables you to handle that. Now, that self-confidence comes from the way you have lived. You've faced a lot of lesser things along the way, and you have been able to overcome them. I'm afraid that we have a society that's been moving away from that. We don't even let our kids have chances, take risks, or anything like that. So they're not going to be able to handle the kind of fears that are going on in life. So I just feel very fortunate that I grew up the way I did, and I don't remember ever being afraid.
Wow, the right stuff. This program partially is about putting the space program, the manned space program, into the context of the Cold War. I don't know if you guys know, but Apollo 7 was kind of that was the first manned flight of the Apollo mission. They had set some up unmanned, and they had worked perfectly, but it's a different deal when you got real guys up there. So your mission was very sort of pivotal in this moon, beat the Russians, all that stuff. Put that in context of the Cold War.
Well, first off, all the unmanned launches were not perfect. They had a problem.
We were told the press told us they were.
Yeah, well, there was something, but you see, we had good engineers. It wasn't, the astronauts got the glory because we were sitting at the tip of the spear, but believe me, what we had was there were 400,000 people that worked on that program, government and civilian employees. Those people, they had the guts too. And for example, today we don't think about it, but our management, the management people at the Johnson Space Center and throughout NASA, I think, I was just mostly familiar with it there at JSC. Management had the nerve to make decisions and go with the results of it. And today, it's all too frequently, unless they can reduce those risks to zero, they don't want to make that decision, management decision. So we were fortunate to have people in all fields in those days who owned the program. Many of them were much more emotional about the program than I think I was at the time. I was just doing my job, kind of.
Part of it was the urgency, though, right? Because the Cold War, everybody believed we had to get to the moon first.
Well, I don't know, but getting back to your question about with the Russians,
Yeah.
you see, we started off, the Russians, from the very beginning, it's a little bit different now, things have changed a lot, but from the beginning, the Russians were very focused on the public relations aspect of it. They wanted to be ahead whenever they could. For example, when they knew that we were planning on the second Gemini flight for Ed White to go out and have an EVA, and test a little maneuvering device, they did everything they could to get Alexei Leonov to do it. And they did it with a spacecraft that wasn't built for it. I mean, that was really risky because they were really, they knew when they were taking risks and they were willing to go do that just to be out in front if they could.
So Leonov would be the first to walk in space.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he didn't really walk. I mean, I know Alexei, I was with him just a couple weeks ago. He's like the Buzz Aldrin of the Russian program now.
We got it.
Yeah, okay. And anyhow, that was, I think it was 12 minutes, and the whole effort was aimed at how to get him back in because the little port that they had there. I mean, it was a terrible event, but they beat us by more than a month on doing that, and so they focused on those kind of things, and they did some very dangerous, risky things. That's the downside. On the upside, they've been very, very fortunate. They've had very few accidents, and they've had terrible kind of accidents that they've survived. It's just, I've been tremendously impressed with that. But back in those days, by the time we had the Gemini spacecraft, keep in mind you're getting my personal opinion, you're not getting official statements on these things. The Gemini program, that was a more capable spacecraft than I even see today in the Russian launches that they had. It could maneuver more, it could do more things, and that was back, 40 years ago, more than 50 years ago. So, in the meantime, the Russians have converted more to what I consider more of an engineering aspects, exploration in the future, and it's a lot cheaper for them over there. It has been over the years. So we were engaged in a real fight, and it was like a fight to the finish to get there. And the first time we even met any of the Russians, it might have been after Ed White and I can't remember his name right now. It was after their mission. I think it was the first time we even met any of the cosmonauts. Over the years, they've become very, very good friends. We've got organizations that we work together, Association of Space Explorers, and they get along very well. They're living together right now up there on the International Space Station. And as a matter of fact, they've outmaneuvered us administratively and cost-wise. We're like beginners compared to how they've taken advantage of all of this right now.
Okay, so public relations, and isn't that part of the reason we said, okay, after your flight, we're going to send these guys around the moon because we were worried the Russians were going to do that before us?
There was great concern about the Russians beating us to the moon. We were not exposed to a lot of the military intelligence they might have had, or government intelligence. So it was, within us, it was kind of what we knew and felt and heard, but there were people that knew what the Russians were doing to push for it. They must have, even in those days, must have had some pictures. The Russians are developing a rocket, the N-1 rocket, 10 million pounds of thrust. They were going to go out to the moon, and they were doing everything they could to do that. What was the focus of the question?
Well, Apollo 8 was
Oh, yes.
originally not going to go to the moon, and then we sent it up quick.
And the Russians were shooting to go out and to go around the moon, not a landing. They didn't have any landing except for it. But before Apollo 7, probably a month or so before Apollo 7 flew, they started talking, not us, the administration people at NASA, about Apollo 8 going around the moon. That was a brand new thing. We had 5 giant steps to go to the moon. We were going to test the spacecraft in Earth orbit. That was what we did. And they were going to test the lunar module. He didn't follow instructions, did he? And then,
Houston, we have a problem.
and then we're going to test the lunar module in Earth orbit. And then they're going to fly a flight either close to or around the moon, and then do the simulation, and then do the landing. Well, administrators now. The administrators did this. They sat down and said, you know, we could take Apollo 8 and instead of just flying a high orbit with it, we could send it out around the moon. And they considered everything, and it was based on the success of Apollo 7. They decided that if Apollo 7 was successful, that they would then go ahead and have 8 go out and around the moon. And it turns out that only later did I begin to realize this. Apollo 7 to this day is the longest, most ambitious, most successful engineering test flight of any new machine ever. And the reason it was so loaded, 11 days, planned 11-day first mission, was because we had lost 21 months after the Apollo 1 fire, say a year and a half, or maybe a little less than that, because we would have had another flight in there, to go to the moon. And we had to do it, supposedly, by the end of the decade. So we were trying to make up for all that. So when we went up for an 11-day mission, none of us thought we were going to go 11 days. You know, you couldn't do that on the first mission. So we were actually surprised, a little bit irritated towards the end. You know, no film left, no nothing, but we still had to go 2 more days.
Want a shower, get me back.
So that was critical, and because it was so successful, Apollo 8 then went out and went around the moon. And of course, that's what everybody thinks of as the first of the Apollo program these days.
Well, now, we gotta find out from you, because all the astronauts talk about it, but tell us in your own words, when you first got that view from space, how did it hit you? What was it like? What was weightlessness like? Go back, remember.
I don't have a lot of useful things to say about that, because
you're an astronaut and you're the right stuff and you're tough, but go down into your inner...
no, it makes me think that maybe I just was totally insensitive to those kind of things, because we knew that after one orbit around, and of course we'd never been around the world before. Hell, I'm the only guy I know of that went around the world 163 times before I ever went to Europe. So when we were up there, we knew that we were going to have to separate and come back and simulate a docking with the S4B stage. And so the last thing in the world we wanted to do was screw up on anything. So while we were around the world a couple of times, I just signed somebody's picture here that on the second time around, we had separated, and we were, Wally was flying, and I was taking pictures from the right side. I was taking pictures of the S4B. And so I was just snapping these pictures, and all the way across the southern part of the United States, and this picture that I signed is the S4B, and later, only later, did I realize it was taken right over where we lifted off. It was right over the Space Center down there, and to this day, that's my favorite picture that I took in orbit. But at the time, I wasn't even looking at that. I was looking at what my job was, and was the S4B, and that's what we were focused on doing things in those days. So I don't even, first time I really started getting a thrill was when we, after that, we separated and went in a different orbit so that we could come back and do a rendezvous for the first time and see how that would work out. And most of the time, people don't realize how difficult it is to see anything on the ground. Did I mention this a couple of times?
No, keep going.
Okay, because you see now, you look at the International Space Station, digital film, any kind of cameras, I mean, fabulous pictures you can see, always oriented towards the ground. In those days, we drifted, and you drifted because you didn't want to be using your fuel and your thrusters because then you really would have come home early. So we were just drifting, and when you think about it, you got, we have 5 windows. And they covered about, I think about 150 degrees. Yeah, the 5 windows covered about 150 degrees. The biggest one was in the hatch. It was a round window, 10 inches in diameter, 2 panes, about, I think it was 3/4 inch quartz, the best glass you could get, separated by a little tiny gap in between, so if the window broke, you'd still be able to keep pressure in the spacecraft. And unless the window was pointing at the ground and you're drifting, and you see a tiny little bit of angle you got up there. And so finally, if it's pointing at the ground and you got the camera and you're not involved in some other thing, you might be able to take a picture. And if you're looking down at the ground, first off, keep in mind that every 45 minutes, you're going into darkness. 45 minutes darkness, 45 minutes daylight, and the camera people didn't want you to take pictures within 5 minutes of sunrise or sunset, because in those days, you may not know about it, but we had Kodachrome film. Do you remember Kodachrome film?
Hey, you couldn't just keep taking photos like you do today. You had to conserve your film.
Oh yeah, we had very limited amount of film on board to save weight also. But so it had to be pointed down. If you pointed down, 55% of the Earth's surface is covered by clouds all the time, on average, 55%. And then the part that's out in the clear, that's usually like the desert, Saudi Arabia. Never saw a cloud over Saudi Arabia. And some wonderful things to take a picture of. You know, you can take a picture and you never even see a city down there in the desert on that. So there was a lot of things like this. You didn't want to take it more than 30 degrees off the vertical because of all the atmosphere you go through. So it was hard to get pictures, believe me, it really was.
You know, we're going to go upstairs later. We're going to ask some questions of the ISS astronaut. And, you know, one of your questions, well, your question is, do we think that we should have fighter pilot training or some kind of training like that for today's astronauts? Back when you guys did it, most of you were fighter pilots, right?
If you were a fighter pilot, you didn't even apply. I mean, there's nothing, there's a lot of changes that's gone on in the people in the space program. You know, for today, you don't have to be a pilot, and one of the reasons you don't have to be a pilot is because in the space shuttle, which is the greatest flying machine ever built by man and operated by man, maybe a minority opinion, but that's, I feel very strongly about that. You always had a couple of pilots, and they did a fantastic job, in my opinion. But because of what went on 40 and 50 years ago, we were able to develop hardware and a program where you could carry passengers up. You didn't have to be a pilot, and that's the way it is now. Now, even with the new capsules that they're coming up with, they're going to be able to take people that aren't pilots. But back in the days when they didn't know what it was going to take, NASA, they decided, where can we get the people that we think we have the best chance of succeeding? Now, the Russians took a different attitude. There's people in the spacecraft did virtually nothing. They were strapped in. They operated that spacecraft. It's always been operated remotely. Even today, it operates remotely. It's not a satisfying thing for an aviator. In those days, we didn't do that. And so they made their best guess of what they thought it was, and they took it from the pilot's field, all military. In fact, our group was the first one where you didn't have to have been a test pilot. Half of our group was test pilots anyway. We had to have the fighter pilot experience. I have always felt that the advantage that gave us, every one of those people, myself included, we'd spent at least 10 or 12 years, sometimes more than that, flying fighter aircraft. In that, you develop the kind of self-confidence that it takes. You think you're the best, whether you're the best or not. You've got to have that kind of an attitude out there. Plus, we've flown with these people and all kinds of things. I was back, mine was at the end of the Korean War, Anybody here remember Korea? Anyway, what that does, it gives you that sense that you can depend on your life on that other guy in that other airplane and in the spacecraft the same way. See, we knew that we could bet our life on our associates, and that worked out very well. Today, they're focused a whole lot more on the right kind of diversity, on who they select. I noticed they just selected, after a couple of years, they just selected another group of astronauts. And the headline in Houston, I don't know what it was where you were, was they selected 8 new astronauts. The big headline was that half women, half men. I mean, that was an accomplishment for somebody, someplace, some particular drive. You know, I frankly wouldn't care if they were all women, if that was the best that we could get to do the job. But today, they're focusing on a different kind of thing. It's the numbers of it. You've got to have the right numbers of minorities and the right number of Caucasians and all this other kind of stuff. I think that's nonsense, but that's just me. I'm an old guy.
But it's true that today they don't have to have the kind of skills that you guys had, because there's a lot more automated stuff in the shuttle, right?
Yeah,
Or
everything.
the space station.
Everything in the world is going that way. It's automated. I bet I'm the only guy in this room that doesn't own a cell phone.
But Buzz Aldrin has 3 or 4 of them. He's
Yeah.
always going one way or the other.
But that's because I don't want to be trapped with all that kind of stuff. But today, that drives all kinds of things. And in some things, it's improving. It improves a lot of techniques and a lot of different things. But frankly, I've been fortunate enough, about 10 years ago, I got to fly an F-16 and an F-18, but I had to tell the guy I was flying with at the time that he could handle what went on my display, because I didn't want to diddle around with the computer screens in order to pick out what I was seeing. I still like the old-fashioned way of flying airplanes, unfortunately.
This guy's old school. I like it. His cell phone isn't going off because he doesn't have one. Look, we now rely on Russia to take us up to the space station. What do you think about that decision to abandon the shuttle before we had a replacement?
It's kind of interesting, because my attitude and my contemporaries, our attitude about the space shuttle is probably different than even a lot of the people that I've talked to involved in the shuttle. Keep in mind that it's a small group of the people in the shuttle that were in the shuttle, that were the pilots that flew it. They were like maybe 25–30% of the astronauts. I think they've got, I don't know, 500 people have flown space now, something like that. And the shuttle enabled you to take all kinds of folks with it. But I personally always bet on the fact that we had really good guys flying that shuttle. Took a lot of training. Some of that training probably bored them after a time. It's my personal opinion that the space shuttle is the greatest flying machine ever built by man. I personally think that the biggest mistake that NASA ever made was canceling that space shuttle without something that was better. Not just something else, but something better. And look what we're doing now at NASA. We're going back to, and some outside contractors, developing capsules. Some of them look just like the Apollo command module, just slightly bigger, maybe 30% bigger or something like that. Doing the re-entries, our LRD was 0.3. I think that the shuttle was like about 0.4 until you drop the gear. Oh, excuse me, not 0.4, 4.0 or 4.1, something like that, until you put the gear down. It took good aviators, took a great airplane, and I think the missions were absolutely fabulous. They lost 2 shuttles along the way, and both of them were due to management decisions that were made. The crew, at the time, had their particular position on both the Columbia and the Challenger before it went was, we probably ought to delay this, ought to put this off. Management made their decisions and went ahead, and you saw what happened, lost the crews.
Yeah, and that was, we all remember probably where we were when both of those disasters happened. I guess I'm going to open up to the audience, but I know you have a particular, you must have a view about Mars, and what's the best way for us to go there? Do we go back to the moon first? Do we just fly directly to Mars like Buzz wants? Do we go to, or to the moon of Mars like Buzz wants? How do we get to Mars?
Well, I'm not a technologist on it anymore. I read it about these things out of the other people's opinions. I form my own opinions about a lot of it. And it's evolved over Mars. I was on a committee back in 1971. We're still talking about the space shuttle and development and about Mars. And at the time, you know, we talked about, well, we could go to Mars in 1984. In retrospect, I know that was kind of ridiculous, and that was the extreme, because another 7 years after that, like 91, that would be more likely. And I doubt if there was a soul in the astronaut office that wouldn't have bet that we would have been to Mars by the year 2000. So that was like 30 years from there. Now, 30 years from now, are we going to be on Mars? I have no idea. I have been in favor of going to Mars, not because I think we're going to find life there. I don't think so at all. But we might. So what? Then there's others who want to go back to the moon. And then there's the really ridiculous idea that we're going to go out to a meteoroid and bring it back here and take pieces off of it. Well, the Japanese landed something on a meteoroid 2 years ago and brought back a specimen from it. So we still have to focus on Mars. Now, the reason we have to focus on Mars is because society moves ahead by pushing the next frontier. And I mentioned it when I was up at MIT a couple of days ago, that when Magellan set out to go around the world back in, it was 500 years ago. That was, what, 17, 15, 19, something like that. And they were going to find the next frontier, and it was the rest of the world. They were sailing around the world for the first time. He had 5 ships, 270 crewmen. When they came back, 1 ship made it back. 17 of those 270 were still alive, but they were willing to push the frontier, and look what's happened in the Western world because they went out and did this. Same thing was happening back in the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, the next frontier was space. The moon was representative of how we're getting away from the Earth's gravitational field and escaping from it and getting out there to the moon. The frontier today is Mars. And back when we did it on Apollo, people were willing to accept the risk, the chance of dangerous adventures. And people were. We did lose people in the Apollo program to do it. And look what it is now. Because of pushing that frontier, which is not an economic return to go out and explore. The economic return comes from all of the things you have to develop to make that possible. And we've been benefiting from it now. You're all benefiting from things that were spun off because of the technology that got pushed in. And some of that was political, but that's it.
Yeah, and those cell phones that they all have, that's all, you know, part of what you guys had.
Well, I was up at MIT, and I'm going to get back to this, because I want to tell about going to Mars. But
Right.
they were pushing, the reason we were up, and by the reason I was up, I never graduated from MIT, because I studied there back in '64 and '65, because they had the computer that we used in the command module. And it was very important. And it was hardwired, the system that they had at the time. But I want you to know this. We had 38 kilobytes of memory in that computer. Kilobytes. Does anybody ever remember a kilobyte? And
38,000 bytes.
And 34 kilobytes were not addressable. We had 4 kilobytes that the software had written to do it. So that kind of development. But the reason you push to the next frontier for different reasons. I don't believe that you are going to make money by going out and doing this. The people that are developing it, they will end up being able to make money because of it. Next frontier is Mars. I used to think about, well, let's just go to Mars, you know, and land on it and return. We had the concepts and all that. The main thing we had to overcome was the radiation problem. And then I finally came around to agree with the people that we had something to gain if we went back to the moon, and that is setting up a site that you learned how to actually live when there was no other way of surviving out there. That would take a lot of work. And now, like you mentioned, Buzz is a big push, and others too, that we make a one-way trip to Mars. And the more I think about it, the more I think that makes a lot of sense. And here's why. The technology and the costs of developing a system that you're going to take out there, fly, land, pick up, launch again, or stay alive until you get to the next decent time to come back to the Earth. That's months and months, and then you come back. Terribly, terribly expensive. You hear these idiots talking today about $5 billion to go to the moon, and to go to Mars, things like that. It's just outlandish. It cost us $25 billion back in the old days to do the whole Apollo program. Today, if you inflate that, it'd be like $125 billion. And believe me, going to Mars is going to be a whole lot tougher than going to the moon. So I think we need to be doing that, and if you could go there and send a couple things out first that might help people survive, then you go out and you land, well, they're probably going to die. I understand that. Big deal. But what I'm getting at is you try, you send stuff out there, try to let them live, and then try to resupply it. You do the things you can. But you've got to be willing to push the boundaries. We no longer have that. We're risk averse.
Very well said. And with that, I think I'm going to open it up to the audience. Can someone tell me what time it is?
You got 10 minutes.
Okay.
Let me
Yeah.
I want to add one thought to that before I do that. And that's because when we talk about Apollo 11 today, first thing you think of is one small step for man, giant leap for mankind. A story I like to tell is that they left on the surface of the moon a microfilm message from the leaders of all the free nations of the world. Microfilm used to be small. That was how we had things. And I got a chance to look at those some weeks afterwards. And I carried with me in my pocket for at least 10 years the message that the Prime Minister of Australia left. I can't remember his name now. Okay.
His wife is reminding him. What was his name? Gordon.
Yeah, Prime Minister Gordon. And he had a couple sentences of platitudes. Then he went on to say, and this is what I think is what we need to be focusing on today, especially here, this is Explorers Club.
Absolutely.
Says, may the high courage and technical genius which made this achievement possible be so used in the future that mankind will live in a world in which peace, self-expression, this is the one, and the chance of dangerous adventure are available to all. We need to get back to that kind of thinking.
I wouldn't disagree. Anybody want to ask a question? This gentleman here, you're going to have to talk into the mic.
Let's stand up, please.
Thank you. Can you share who one of your personal explorer heroes is and why?
My personal, well, I grew up admiring, really, I always wanted to be a pilot because occasionally I'd get to go to a movie on Saturday, and there was a Second World War, and they always had some fighter pilots out there that the heroes. But my boyhood hero was Charles Lindbergh. And at a very early age, he was willing to do that, stick his neck out. And he understood what I was just saying about Prime Minister Gordon's statement. I don't remember the exact quote right now, but he said that, I think he said that if he could live 10 more years before dying, that he would rather do that than not fly.
Okay, yes, Les Guthrie.
Well, I would like to hear more about Apollo 7. I assume your 32 kilobytes of memory didn't put you on cruise control, yes? And did you have technical problems? Tell us about the challenges of the mission itself.
I don't recall, certainly on 7 we didn't have very few technical problems. I think I remember only the alarm going off only twice in 11 days, and we couldn't believe it because we were prepared for anything that could go wrong. And also in those days we didn't all sleep at the same time. I remember Wally and I were on the same sleep pattern, and Don was the guy that was awake when we were asleep. One time I remember I was under one of the couches. I remember waking up and I looked up, I heard an alarm go off. I looked up, Don was up there, but Don was asleep. He was asleep too, and it took about, I bet it didn't take 10 seconds for us to reconfigure things so that it was all over. Believe me, that spacecraft, after Apollo 1 being a disaster really, Apollo CSM 101, which is what we had, that was an amazingly good spacecraft. I feel guilty almost thinking it was a test flight when nothing really went wrong.
Yes, any other questions? Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Who's this guy in the back here?
Thank you. Mr. Cunningham, it's
Yes.
a pleasure to meet you. You know, pilots, you were selected as a pilot because of your ability to handle stress, and I would assume that most really good fighter pilots have a natural ability to handle stress, and that's why you elevated yourself up to an astronaut. Can you remark on any training protocols at NASA, whether they be psychological, medical, or nutritional, that would enhance your ability to deal with stress under difficult conditions?
That's another thing where there's a big difference today. And it's because of the attitudes of the guys back at that time. We didn't allow NASA to really turn you into a specimen very often. I mean, I still get my annual physical at NASA every year because they're keeping a history of people who've gone into space, and I like it because I get to go down and do my physical. But today, astronauts are a whole lot more specimens in the scientific field than they used to be. And part of that is a reaction to what happened in those days with us ancient astronauts. I wasn't as outspoken and as obnoxious as some of them could be. But I do know this, that after the Apollo program was over, and probably during that, management began to try to find ways to reduce astronaut influence on these things. Back in those days, we could go to any of the meetings, and we were involved in all the reviews and all those kind of things. But a lot of it was the people in operations, the mission control, those folks. They started trying to push the leverage of astronauts down some places on it. Secondly, NASA as a government agency, and as it's grown older, it's become much, much more bureaucratic, very much like any government agency. Even they're long enough, they get more money. They're up there. It's one of the reasons that the so-called commercial space industry is able to do these things today, is because NASA has become very expensive. For example, I was at SpaceX out there. Everything is in the one hangar. You see it built over here, it's tested over here in the corner, etc. They don't have to worry about having 9 centers open around the country so that they can keep the congressmen putting the money out to do it. So it's a real change.
Well, that's it for now. I want to thank you guys. Let's have a hand for Walt Cunningham.
my student who just came in, Katie.
Katie Coleman just came, she's gonna present later.
If you'd have gotten here earlier, you could have learned something.
I'm gonna take just a little break, maybe 5 minutes, and then Brian Binney and I are gonna be up here. Thank you very much, Walt, it's a real honor.